The heavy oak doors of the Kwanjin mansion didn't just open. They were burst through by a woman who looked like she'd been spat out of a nightmare. A high-fashion model, a creature of glass and silk who had graced the covers of Vogue Korea only months prior, was now a fractured mess. Her silver wedding gown was shredded at the hem, dragging through the dirt as she sprinted toward the iron gates of the estate. She was barefoot, her panicked breath coming in ragged gasps that clouded the freezing Seoul night air. "He's a monster," she shrieked at the stone-faced security guards who didn't even blink as she scrambled past them. "No woman can survive that. No amount of money is worth your soul." This was Lee Kwan-jin's third bride in a single year. To the world, he was the Dragon King, a man of infinite wealth and terrifying underworld power. But to the women who had seen behind the curtain, he was Don Size, a man whose very physical existence was a curse. They all discovered the same thing on their wedding night. Something in his bed that turned the promise of love into a visceral, paralyzing horror. It wasn't that he was cruel, and it wasn't that he was violent. It was that he was simply too much, too dangerous, a force of nature that the human body wasn't designed to endure. As the model's screams faded into the distance, the whispers in the city grew louder. The Dragon King was a black hole. He destroyed every woman he touched. 3 days later, the atmosphere in the mansion's sterile, gold-leafed foyer was different. There was no trembling, no sobbing, and certainly no fear. Brielle Carter stood in the center of the room, her deep brown skin glowing against the royal purple of her dress, a garment that didn't apologize for her curves but celebrated them. She had just stepped off a plane from Atlanta, carrying a single suitcase and a debt that threatened to swallow her community youth center whole. She had read the contract. She knew the rumors. She had watched the grainy footage of the fleeing models. When the inner sanctum doors finally groaned open, Lee Kwan-jin stepped out. He was a pillar of cold discipline, his white shirt crisp, his sharp features set in a mask of practiced intimidation. He waited for her to flinch. He waited for her to look at the exit. Instead, Brielle adjusted her posture, her expression steady and radiating a quiet dominance that seemed to fill the room more than a shadow did. She didn't see a monster. She saw a man who had been told he was too big for the world, just as she had been told she was too big for its beauty standards. "They say you're impossible to survive," Brielle said, her voice a smooth, low hum that cut through the tension. She met his intense gaze without a hint of hesitation. "But I've been surviving the impossible since the day I was born. I didn't come here to be another girl who runs. I came here because I'm the only woman who can actually handle what you're offering." She took a slow, deliberate step toward him, the purple silk of her dress swishing defiantly. "So let's stop the ghost stories. I want it. Please like and subscribe to this channel as I continue the story." The black Mercedes glided through the reinforced gates of the Kwan-jin estate, a fortress of glass and basalt tucked into the shadows of Namsan Mountain. Brielle sat in the rear, her reflection in the tinted window showing a woman who looked more like a visiting queen than a desperate bride. The driver, the scarred man who hadn't uttered a syllable since the airport, watched her through the rearview mirror with a mixture of suspicion and curiosity. He expected her to be pale, perhaps clutching her pearls or staring wide-eyed at the armed guards patrolling the perimeter. Instead, Brielle was reapplying a coat of deep plum lipstick, her hands steady as the car climbed the winding driveway. When the vehicle came to a halt, the driver stepped out to open her door, but Brielle was already out, the heels of her boots clicking sharply against the heated cobblestones. She didn't wait for direction. She looked at the sprawling mansion, a masterpiece of cold, modern architecture, and saw it for what it was, a high-priced cage. At the entrance, a line of household staff stood in perfect, terrifying formation. An elderly woman in a stiff black hanbok stepped forward, her eyes scanning Brielle's figure with blatant disapproval. "There are rules here, Mrs. Lee," the woman said, her voice like dry parchment. "The wives of a Dragon King Do not enter through the main foyer unless summoned. You are to be taken to the West Wing, where you will be bathed, measured, and prepared for tonight's inspection. You are not to speak unless addressed, and you are never to touch anything in the master's personal quarters. Brielle didn't move toward the side entrance. Instead, she smoothed the silk of her purple dress and stepped directly into the woman's personal space, using her height and presence to tilt the power dynamic. "My name is Brielle Carter," she said, her voice dropping into a resonant, honeyed tone that commanded the air around them. "And I don't do wings. If I'm the woman who's supposed to save this household from its own ghost stories, I'll start by walking through the front door." She brushed past the stunned housekeeper, her suitcase trailing behind her. The interior was a cathedral of silence and expensive marble, smelling of sandalwood and old secrets. She could feel the eyes of the hidden security cameras tracking her every movement. She knew she was being watched by the man in the crisp white shirt, the one who lived in the center of this storm. As she reached the center of the grand hall, she paused, looking up at the sprawling chandelier that hung like a frozen explosion. She didn't look like a woman afraid of a monster. She looked like a woman who had finally found a room big enough to hold her. "Tell your master I'm in the library," she called out to the empty, echoing space. "And tell him if he wants to prepare me for anything, he can bring the tea himself." She didn't follow the rules of the wives who came before her, because she wasn't here to survive Lee Kuan-jin. She was here to claim him. The library was a cavern of dark mahogany and leather, illuminated only by the flicker of a fireplace and the cold moonlight bleeding through floor-to-ceiling windows. Brielle didn't sit in the stiff, guest-appropriate chairs. Instead, she had found a velvet chaise longue, her purple dress draped over the fabric like a spilled glass of wine. When Lee Kuan-jin finally entered, he didn't walk. He materialized from the shadows, his presence a heavy, suffocating pressure that usually forced people to their knees. He was still in that crisp white shirt, the top button now undone, revealing a glimpse of a jagged scar that vanished beneath the collar. He didn't greet her. He moved to a sideboard and poured 2 glasses of a dark, viscous liquid from a decanter that looked older than the city of Seoul. He walked over, his eyes locked on hers with a predator's focus, and handed her a glass. "The last woman who sat where you were sitting didn't make it to dinner," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "She saw the files on this desk. She saw the names of the men I've had to remove to keep this empire standing. She realized that being the wife of the Dragon King isn't a title. It's a death sentence." He leaned down, placing one hand on the back of the chaise, caging her in. The air between them hummed with a terrifying static. "I am a man who has traded his soul for power, Brielle. My hands are stained with things your community center could never pray away. You think you want this, but you are playing with a fire that doesn't just burn, it consumes." Brielle didn't pull back. She didn't even blink. She took a slow, deliberate sip of the drink, swirled it around her tongue, and then made a face of mild disappointment. She set the glass down on a $1,000 antique side table with a definitive thud. "It's a 2012 Cabernet, isn't it?" she asked, her voice calm and unimpressed. Kuan-jin paused, his intimidation tactic momentarily snagged on her indifference. "The tannins are too aggressive, and it's far too acidic for a conversation this heavy. If you're trying to scare me with your dark past, Kuan-jin, at least have the decency to serve a wine that has actually matured. This tastes like it's trying too hard, just like this speech." She stood up, forcing him to straighten or be brushed by her shoulder. She was inches from him now, her deep brown skin a striking contrast to his pale, disciplined features. She reached up and straightened his collar, her touch lingering just long enough to feel the frantic beat of his pulse, a pulse that betrayed his supposed coldness. "I've looked into the eyes of men who wanted to take my home, my dignity, and my life," she whispered, her gaze piercing his mask. "You're not a monster to me. You're just a man who's been lonely for so long he's forgotten how to be human. Now, are we going to keep talking about your body count, Or are you going to show me to a kitchen where the wine actually matches the host's ego? She walked past him toward the dining hall, leaving the Mafia Boss standing in the silence of his own library, holding a glass of wine that suddenly tasted like vinegar. The dining room was a cathedral of cold glass and sharp edges, but the atmosphere had shifted. The dinner sat untouched between them, the steam from the braised short ribs curling into the air like white flags of surrender. Lee Kuan-jin was no longer caging her in with his shadow. He sat across from her, his posture cracking for the first time. The silence in the mansion was so heavy it felt physical, a thick veil that only the truth could pierce. "You speak of my reputation as if it were a choice," Kuan-jin began, his voice barely a whisper, devoid of its earlier jagged edge. He didn't look at her. He looked at his own hands, large and capable of crushing bone. "They call me Don-sized to mock the women who fled, but for me, it is a physiological prison. It is a rare genetic anomaly, a hyperactive growth condition that never truly settled. But the curse isn't just the physical reality. It is the memory." He finally lifted his gaze, and for the first time, Brielle saw the hollow ache behind the Dragon King's eyes. "My first wife. I loved her, or I thought I did. But on our wedding night, I saw a look in her eyes that I have never been able to erase. It wasn't passion. It was genuine, primitive terror. I felt like a monster breaking a porcelain doll. She didn't just leave. She was hospitalized for weeks, her spirit shattered by the mere proximity of me. The second wife didn't even wait for the lights to go out. She saw me undress and ran as if the devil himself was in the room. He stood up, pacing the length of the window, his silhouette cutting a lonely figure against the Seoul skyline. I have built this empire, this fortress of black glass, because out there, I'm a titan to be feared. But in here, in the dark, I am a man who cannot even offer an embrace without the fear of causing trauma. My body is a weapon I cannot put down. That is why I pay the dowries. That is why I buy the silence. I'm tired of seeing the women I touch turn into ghosts." Brielle watched him, her heart steady, her empathy rising not as pity, but as a bridge. She rose from her chair and walked toward him, ignoring the way he instinctively flinched back to protect her from himself. She didn't stop until she was close enough to feel the radiant heat coming off his skin. "You see a weapon," Brielle said, her voice a soft, grounding vibration in the silent room. "But I've spent my life being told I'm too much, too loud, too dark, too big, too difficult. I've been told I take up too much space. Maybe the reason those other women ran wasn't because you were a monster, Kuan-jin. Maybe it was because they were too small to hold the space you need." She reached out, her hand hovering just inches from his chest. "I'm not porcelain. I'm earth, and you can't break the ground you stand on." The following evening, the oppressive silence of the mansion was shattered not by a scream, but by the rhythmic thud of a knife against a wooden cutting board and the sizzling aroma of seasoned fat. Brielle had commandeered the kitchen, much to the horror of the chef who had spent a decade preparing calorie-perfect, soulless meals for the Dragon King. When Kuan-jin entered, lured by a scent that was entirely foreign to his sterile world, he found Brielle with her sleeves rolled up, her skin glowing from the steam of a bubbling pot of collard greens and slow-simmered neck bones. "What is this?" he asked, hovering at the edge of the granite island, as if the warmth of the room were a trap. "The staff said you dismissed the kitchen brigade." "The staff says a lot of things," Brielle replied, not looking up as she slid a batch of golden, honey-brushed cornbread out of the oven. "Tonight, you're not eating Mafia Boss food. You're eating soul food. It's heavy, it's loud, and it's meant to be shared." She gestured to the stool across from her. "Seat, and leave the brooding at the door." Kuan-jin sat, his movements stiff and uncertain. Brielle placed a plate before him, smothered chicken, mac and cheese with a crust that crackled, and greens that had been cooking since noon. He took a tentative bite, the rich, smoky flavors exploding against a palate used to the cold refinement of sushi and steak. As the warmth hit his stomach, the tension in his shoulders, a tension he had carried since his youth, began to visibly fray. My mother used to say that you can't truly know a person until you've seen them eat something they love, Brielle said, leaning her elbows on the counter. She didn't talk about contracts or gang wars. She told him about the neighborhood kids back in Atlanta, about the way the sun hit the community center's cracked windows in July, and how she had learned to negotiate with landlords before she could drive. For the first time, Kwon spoke of a life before the Dragon King title. He spoke of the isolation of being a gifted child who grew too fast, of the father who saw him only as a biological asset to be weaponized, and the terrifying loneliness of a man everyone was paid to fear. He found himself laughing, a short, rusty sound, at one of Brielle's stories about a failed bake sale. The ice didn't just melt, it shattered. In the glow of the kitchen lights, he wasn't a monster or a king. He was a man who had finally found someone who wasn't looking at him as a threat or a paycheck. As they finished the meal, his hand hovered near hers on the counter. He didn't pull away this time. The discipline was still there, but the wall was gone, replaced by a rare, vulnerable connection that tasted far sweeter than the honeyed cornbread. The Grand Hyatt Seoul was a shimmering hive of the city's elite, a sea of slender silhouettes and diamonds that felt as cold as the winter air outside. Brielle entered the ballroom on Kwon arm, a vibrant splash of royal purple in a world of muted grays and blacks. She felt the weight of 100 gazes, sharp, judgmental, and heavy with the expectation that she would wither under their scrutiny. Beside her, Kwon was a pillar of shadow and steel, his hand resting firmly against the small of her back, a silent declaration of ownership that the room was struggling to process. The whispers began before they even reached the champagne fountain. A group of socialites, draped in couture that cost more than Brielle's youth center, huddled together, their laughter like the clinking of thin ice. "Is that the new one?" One hissed loud enough for the sound to carry. "I heard he had to import her because no civilized woman would stay. Look at the size of her. She looks like she's about to burst out of that dress. It's a tragedy, really. No wonder he hides her away." Brielle didn't break her stride. She kept her chin high, her expression a mask of regal indifference, though she felt the familiar sting of being treated like a curiosity in a gallery. She reached for a glass of bubbly, but before her fingers could touch the flute, the laughter reached a crescendo. One man, a prominent tech mogul with a reputation for cruelty, stepped into their path, his eyes raking over Brielle's curves with a sneer. "Kwon, my friend," he drawled, "I knew your tastes were unconventional, but I didn't realize the Dragon King had developed a hunger for something so substantial. Surely there wasn't enough room in the car for both of you." The temperature in the room didn't just drop, it plummeted. The air became thick with the sudden, violent silence of a predator about to strike. Kwon didn't shout. He didn't even raise his hand. He simply stepped forward, his eyes turning into shards of black glass that seemed to pin the man to the spot. The sheer weight of his underworld authority rippled through the ballroom, causing the music to stutter and die. "You speak of substance," Kwon said, his voice a low, terrifying vibration that made the champagne glasses on the nearby table tremble. He reached out, his large hand gently but possessively cupping Brielle's shoulder. "But you are a man of paper and shadows. This woman has more courage in her smallest finger than you have in your entire bloodline. She is not too much for this room. This room is far too small for her." He leaned in closer to the man, his voice dropping to a whisper that echoed like a threat. "If I hear so much as a breath of disrespect directed toward my wife again, I will not only erase your name from this guest list, I will erase your name from this city. Do I make myself clear?" The mogul turned ashen, his glass shaking as he retreated into the crowd. Kwon turned back to Brielle, his expression softening into something so vulnerable it was almost painful to witness. He leaned down, his lips brushing her ear. "They are blind, Brielle," he whispered. "Let them stare. They've never seen a queen before. He didn't wait for her to respond, leading her toward the center of the dance floor, forcing the elite to part like the Red Sea before them. The glitter of the ballroom felt like a distant memory as the elevator hummed its way down to the sub-basement parking garage. The silence here was different. Not the respectful hush of the mansion, but a heavy, predatory stillness that prickled the skin on the back of Brielle's neck. Kwon Jin had been pulled away for a mandatory security briefing by Executive Han, leaving Brielle to head to the car with only a single junior guard. She sensed the trap before she saw it. The air smelled too strongly of cigarette smoke and cheap gasoline, scents that didn't belong in a five-star hotel's private berth. "Wait," Brielle whispered, catching the guard's elbow just as they rounded the pillar toward the black Mercedes. The response was immediate. Two silver SUVs roared out from behind the concrete columns, tires screeching as they boxed them in. Doors flew open, and 6 men in tactical gear spilled out, their faces obscured by balaclavas. These weren't the elites from the Gala. These were the Iron Syndicate's cleaners, sent to cut the Dragon King's heart out by removing the woman who had dared to claim it. The junior guard reached for his holster, but a suppressed round caught him in the shoulder, sending him spiraling to the floor. Brielle didn't scream. She had grown up in a neighborhood where you learned to read the rhythm of a street fight before you learned to read a map. She knew that in a cage match, the biggest person usually wins, not by being fast, but by being immovable. As the first attacker lunged, swinging a retractable baton, Brielle didn't retreat. She stepped into his space, using her weight as a physical wall. She caught his wrist, her grip like iron, and used his own momentum to slam his head into the reinforced concrete pillar. "You're playing in the wrong league, baby," she hissed, her voice a low, dangerous rumble. She remembered the layout of the garage from the way in. She dove behind a heavy industrial trash bin, pulling a small canister of high-grade hairspray from her clutch, the kind she used to keep her edges laid in the humidity. When the next 2 men approached, weapons drawn, she didn't wait for them to aim. She sparked her luxury lighter, creating a localized jet of flame that blinded the lead attacker. In the chaos, she grabbed a heavy tire iron leaning against a nearby maintenance cart. She moved with a surprising, graceful ferocity, a purple-clad storm in the dimly lit garage. She wasn't fighting like a mafia wife. She was fighting like a woman who had protected her community from vultures her whole life. By the time Kwon Jin burst through the stairwell doors, gun drawn and eyes wild with a terror he had never known, he found Brielle standing over 3 groaning men, her dress torn but her spirit untouched. She was breathing hard, her hair slightly mussed, holding the tire iron like a scepter. She looked at him, her gaze steady and fierce. "You're late," she said, a small, defiant smirk playing on her lips. "But don't worry, I kept the change." The silence of the safe house was punctured only by the ragged, wet sound of Kwon Jin's breathing. A stray bullet from the garage ambush had grazed his side, slicing deep enough to turn his crisp white shirt into a road map of crimson. As he slumped against the velvet sofa, his face pale and eyes flickering with the onset of shock, his men stood paralyzed. Executive Han and the high-ranking soldiers hovered in the doorway, their faces masks of indecision. Without the Dragon King's barked orders, the Iron Syndicate's hierarchy was a hollow shell, ready to collapse into chaos while the enemy circled outside. Brielle stepped into the center of the room, her purple dress stained with grease and blood, yet she had never looked more like a ruler. She saw the fear in the men's eyes, the kind of fear that gets people killed. She didn't ask for permission. She moved to Kwon Jin's side, her hands firm and steady as she applied pressure to the wound with a silk scarf. "Get the medical kit and a bottle of high-proof whiskey. Now," she commanded, her voice a low, resonant bell that vibrated through the room. Executive Han hesitated, his eyes flashing with a final spark of defiance. "You are a guest, American. You do not command the Dragon Kings. Brielle stood up, her presence expanding until she seemed to dwarf every armed man in the room. She didn't shout. She didn't need to. Your king is bleeding out because you were too slow to clear the perimeter, she said, her gaze pinning Han to the wall. Right now, the only thing standing between this house and the syndicate is me. If you want to argue about rank, do it over my dead body. Otherwise, get the supplies, station 3 men at the north entrance, and tell the snipers to go dark. If anyone moves without my word, they don't answer to the king. They answer to me. The shift in the room was instantaneous. The men, trained to respect power in its purest form, saw the quiet dominance in Brielle's stance. They saw a woman who wasn't intimidated by their guns or their shadows. One by one, they bowed their heads and moved to obey. Quan Jin reached out, his large, trembling hand catching Brielle's wrist. His grip was weak, but his eyes were wide with a new kind of wonder. Brielle, he wheezed, the pain etched into his sharp features. Hush now, she whispered, her expression softening as she leaned down to kiss his forehead. I told you I was Earth, Quan Jin, and the Earth doesn't move for anyone. Rest. How about the wheel? For the first time in his life, the Dragon King closed his eyes and let someone else carry the weight of the world, trusting the woman who was finally too much for his enemies to handle. The air inside the abandoned dockside warehouse was thick with the scent of salt, rust, and the metallic tang of impending violence. Brielle stood alone in the center of the cavernous space, the dim overhead lights casting long, flickering shadows across the concrete floor. She looked vulnerable, a solitary woman in a torn purple dress, but her eyes remained as steady as the deep Atlantic. From the darkness of the shipping containers, Executive Han emerged, his movements sleek and serpent-like. He wasn't alone. 4 of his loyalists trailed him, their silenced pistols raised. Han's face, usually a mask of subservient discipline, was twisted into a sneer of pure triumph. The Dragon King is weak, bleeding out in a safe house while his queen wanders into a trap, Han drawled, his voice echoing off the corrugated metal walls. You were a useful distraction, Brielle, but the syndicate offered me a seat at a table you weren't invited to. This is where your American dream ends. He leveled his weapon at her chest, his finger tightening on the trigger. Brielle didn't flinch. She didn't beg. Instead, she let out a short, dry laugh that sounded like a challenge. You really think I'm that easy, Han? She asked, her voice dropping into that low, dangerous register that had once silenced the ballroom. You think I didn't notice the way you checked your watch every time the syndicate moved? Or how the security feeds in the garage went dark exactly 10 seconds before the ambush? I've dealt with snakes like you back in Atlanta before I could even vote. You're predictable. Fans mirkfaltaret. It doesn't matter what you know. You're cornered. Am I? Brielle tilted her head, her expression radiating a quiet, dominant confidence. She reached into the folds of her dress and pulled out a small, encrypted tablet, the one Han had left unattended in the library. I didn't just find your offshore accounts, Han. I mirrored them. 10 minutes ago, I sent your location, your transaction history with the syndicate, and your signed confession to the elders of the Quan Jin Council. And as for your men, as if on cue, the red laser dots of high-powered rifles appeared on Han's chest and the foreheads of his soldiers. From the rafters, the Dragon King's elite guard, the ones who truly knew where the power lay, descended like shadows. Brielle stepped forward, her presence expanding until she seemed to fill the entire warehouse. She took the gun from Han's trembling hand, her gaze pinning him to the spot. I told you before, she whispered, her voice a cold, resonant promise. I'm not a guest. I'm the woman who owns this house. And in my house, we don't tolerate rats. She didn't need to pull the trigger. The look in her eyes told Han he was already dead. The trap hadn't been for her. She had been the bait, and the snake had finally swallowed the hook. The seasons in Seoul, turned from the biting grip of winter to a spring that felt like a long-awaited exhale. In the heart of Atlanta, the Community Youth Center no longer wore a notice of demolition. Instead, a new plaque hung over the freshly painted doors, dedicating the building to a legacy of resilience. The debt was settled, but the woman who had left to save it had returned as something far greater than a benefactor. She was the cornerstone of a new kind of power. Inside the glass penthouse, the air had lost its antiseptic chill. The sterile black marble was now softened by the presence of Brielle's life, vibrant art on the walls, the lingering scent of home-cooked spices, and the sound of laughter that actually reached the corners of the rooms. Lee Kwon-jin stood by the window, but he was no longer a shadow trapped in a tomb. Under Brielle's influence, the Dragon King had begun the grueling, legitimate transition of his empire. The underworld business was being dismantled, folded into gray market, global logistics, and tech ventures that traded blood for data and influence. He was still a man to be feared, but he was no longer a man who had to hide. The physical barrier that had once been his curse had become their shared sanctuary. In the quiet intimacy of their bedroom, the lights stayed on. There was no terror, no fleeing, and no shame. Brielle had taught him that a body built for war could also be a vessel for peace, provided it was met by someone with the strength to hold it. She didn't just survive his presence. She commanded it, meeting his intensity with a steady, unapologetic passion that proved the world was wrong. He wasn't too much, and neither was she. There was simply a scale that had finally found its balance. As they stood together on the balcony, watching the city lights of Seoul sparkle like a carpet of fallen stars, Kwon-jin reached out and drew her against his chest. He didn't hesitate, and he didn't pull back. "They still whisper about us," he murmured into her hair, his voice deep and grounded. The Mafia Boss and the woman who didn't run. Brielle leaned back against him, her deep brown skin a beautiful contrast to his crisp linen shirt. She looked out at the empire they were building, one founded on truth rather than fear. "Let them whisper," she said, a confident smile touching her lips. "They're just trying to understand how two people the world called too much became exactly enough for each other. In a world that demanded everyone play small, they had chosen to live large, proving that the greatest strength wasn't in the power you held over others, but in the person you were brave enough to stay for."